How many people?
A few. All right, welcome all. Thank you for turning up to our ERI seminar today, particularly as we had to have a very late reschedule because Darren got a bit stuck because of all the cyclone damage. We're really lucky to have Darren today. So this is Darren Coker. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Red Sea Research Centre at KAUST, which is the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology based in Saudi Arabia. Darren originally did his PhD at James Cook University. We actually were in the same lab, and I used to study fish with Darren. And he was looking at the effects of live coral and their importance for coral-dwelling fish. Since his PhD, he's really branched out and done a lot of work on impacts of climate change and more broadly on ecology and biogeography of reef fish, and particularly since he's been at KAUST, really looking at the Red Sea communities of reef fish. So I think that's what Darren's going to talk to us about today. I'll hand it over to you, Darren.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you. Good to see you guys. Yeah, so there's a few familiar faces in the crowd, but for everyone else, I'm just going to give a very broad kind of overview of the Red Sea and some of the work we've been doing there, particularly in reef fish, which is my background as a reef fish ecologist. Just try and change slides. Okay, there we go. So for those of you unfamiliar with the area, so I'm from KAUST, which is the King Abdullah University for Science and Technology. And this was founded in 2009 by the king at the time, King Abdullah. And it was a university set up to basically do science and technology. So some of these key areas were desert agriculture, solar energy, clean combustion, materials, and of course, science related to the Red Sea. And so the university is situated right on the coast. So most of the offices look out over the water. And this gives us really good access to the marine environment. And so I've been there for the last 9 years, working as a reef fish ecologist there. And so one of the main centres is the Red Sea Research Centre, and then within that is the Reef Ecology Lab. And the lab sort of covers all sort of facets of the marine environment. So we have a lot of work working on megafauna, particularly the whale sharks that aggregate there in the late summer period. We also look at some aspects of fisheries, some seabirds. So we currently have a PhD student looking at tracking and tagging seabirds, as well as turtles and turtle nesting, and then also aspects of oceanography as well. So the Red Sea is a long sort of narrow basin. It's around 2,000 kilometers in length, and the width sort of varies a little bit, but overall it's relatively narrow, and then it has this very deep trench through the middle of the sea there. And so the deepest part gets down to about 3,000 meters, and it's also surrounded by desert environments as well. And this creates a very extreme environment. And a lot of this is to do with the temperature in the region. And so particularly in this part of the world, we normally think of brown areas over through the sea as runoff. One of the unique things about the Red Sea is there's very, very little, if no terrestrial runoff. So because there's no rain, there's nothing flushing out into the water for most of the year. Every now and then there's some heavy thunderstorms which will release some water through the wadis into the sea. But we do get these large sandstorm events, and so this is a large terrestrial sort of input that we have periodically as the seasons are changing. And so it's an extreme environment, and this is driven by the water temperature mainly. So in summertime, we have temperatures up to around 34 degrees, and in the wintertime in the low 20s. And it's quite uniform with depth. So if you go down to the deepest part, it doesn't get much colder than 21 degrees. But the surface areas in the summer is very warm. And we also get this latitudinal gradient in water temperature as well. So the image there with the red through to the yellow represents the temperature. And so in the southern area, we have much warmer temperatures, and then in the northern area is much cooler. So this provides a natural gradient for us to look at effects of temperature on reef communities and marine communities. We also have a similar pattern in productivity. So in the south, it's a much more productive area as we get some water coming through the strait at the bottom and bringing nutrients in there, as well as upwellings in that area. It's also very high evaporation rates, and this causes a lot of changes in salinity as well. So we have a gradient in salinity across there as well. And just a couple of photos there. The top one is sort of a standard photo of coral reefs in the central region. And so the water is often very clear. We often have visibility excess of 30 meters. And so this photo here is a diver sitting at 30 meters looking up, and so you can easily see right up. And we have these very sort of steep reef fronts coming up out of really deep water, creating these walls covered in rich coral reefs. And the photo on the bottom is a image from down the south in the Farallon Islands. So it's a little bit more turbid there and slightly different structure and coral reef communities as well. So it's known as a biodiversity hotspot. The reefs there are teeming with life. You can see a lot of diversity if you visit any of these inshore to offshore habitats. And for corals, there's roughly around 360 species of live corals there. And there's also a lot of endemism in the area with both inverts, corals, and fishes as well. So I'm also part of a group that's been putting out these structures called arms. And so these have been looking at the biodiversity of the benthic ecology and also small inverts that inhabit these. But sort of my main focus and why the work that I'm doing in the Red Sea is based around reef fish communities, biodiversity, ecology, and behavior. And so at present, there's roughly just over 1,000 species of fish associated with shallow reefs in the region, and this is quite high. And this is also always changing. So as we're finding new species, this is changing. But not only that, there's a lot of species of fish in the Red Sea that look the same as species of fish outside of the Red Sea that we're now finding are genetically different. So this is meaning we're having to update checklists all the time and also reassign some of these fish species. So interestingly, there's two photos there of butterfly fish on the right there. Over half of the butterfly fish in the Red Sea are endemic to the region as well. And the other fish is the clownfish. We only have one species of clownfish there, and that is also endemic. So there's a lot of species that you come across in there that you can't find anywhere else. And this is likely due to changes in sea level through time that's isolating the areas and creating pockets for these species to change and evolve. The endemism in reef fish is also very high, so it's roughly around 14%. But again, we're finding that this number is changing too, where we find some of the species in the Red Sea are actually different than the species outside of the Red Sea. So just when I moved to KAUST in 2014, and the year before that, this review was published by the Reef Ecology Lab. And this is kind of the reason why I've been there so long. And what it showed back in 2013 is really how little we know about the region. And so these figures are all showing publications through time. The green and the blue one is the Great Barrier Reef in the Caribbean. So you can see there's a lot of work being done in these regions, and the red lines along the bottom is very low, and this is publications in the Red Sea. And you can look at this through a number of different topics or taxa, and you can find the same trend where we just have very little knowledge. And this is kind of engaged me enough to stay there for 9 years, because it's really a black box when you're there. And when I first arrived, I was coming from the Great Barrier Reef, I was asking questions that are commonly known about the Red Sea, and everyone was giving me, I don't know, we don't know, we haven't looked yet. So it's really, in that period of time was understudied, and even now there's still very little we know. We're just starting to scratch at some of these questions and some of these topics and starting to put some pieces together to be able to understand the system as a whole. As a lab, we've updated this, so we currently have a new review that's just been written and close to being submitted, that's looking at what we've done in the last decade, as well as the historical work for the whole Red Sea region, looking at spatial trends and also different topics as well. But again, the trend is the same. We still don't know much about the region. And also what we do know is often concentrated in a few areas in the Red Sea and not uniform throughout. So some of the work I've been involved with since I've been there is one of them was trying to really get a handle on the biodiversity of reef fish in the region. So trying to catalog it, categorize it. So led by Dr. Joey DeTista, sitting there in the blue t-shirt. He's currently the head fish curator at the Sydney Australian Museum. We spent a lot of time up and down the coast collecting fish using different methods, and all of these fish were fin clipped so that we could create a genetic library for future projects, and also go towards looking at whether species were what we thought they were or not, and also preserving some of these fish as well. So just to give you a summary, you can see the first big bar there is the Saudi Arabia collection. So a large number of fish were collected from there, and basically have a tissue library of about 10,000 fin clips from fish all over the various regions of the Red Sea. And we've also sent over 800 specimens to the California Academy of Science to be vouchered there as well. So there's whole specimens stored there. Also to try and build on what's going on in this area, and also given that we have access to a large latitude of reefs in the Red Sea, given Saudi Arabia has a majority of the coast on the right there, we've been doing a lot of work. I've been conducting a lot of surveys with a colleague of mine, Alex Gatan. And so I've been trying to build up an idea of what's going on in the Red Sea, what are the spatial patterns, the temporal patterns with fish communities, so that we can start to build up an idea of not only spatially, but how things are tracking through time. And we don't really have a baseline. So obviously what we are collecting is a shifted baseline, but it gives us something to try and understand which areas are potentially pristine or in good condition. So far we've done close to 200 reefs from north to south. We're lucky we've been right down to the Farrison Islands early in 2014, because this area is not really accessible to us lately with the war in the south. And unfortunately, we haven't been up into the Gulf yet, the Gulf of Aden right in the top. So we're looking to get up there in the next few months to actually get some data from that region. And that region right in the north is quite interesting, because there is records of endemic species in that Gulf compared to the rest of the Red Sea. So we've been conducting standardized fish surveys up and down the coast, standardized depths, and from these we've been recording abundances, but also size estimates as well, so we can start looking at changes in fish sizes and also biomass estimates. And we've also been selecting some of these sites as long-term monitoring areas where we can put down permanent transects and actually go back and map these through time. And so what we're finding is that, just like some of these environmental gradients, we're finding some changes up and down the coast with fish communities, and just, roughly some of them that we can show there is richness, abundance, and also biomass. And so you can see with abundance, it's probably a bit hard to see there, but the light green one is actually very low compared to the others. And that could be representative because it's quite close to a major city, coastal city there, whereas the others aren't. And we can also see in the bottom figure, which is biomass, there's some changes with gradient. And one of the highest ones is the Farrison Banks, which is down in the central region. And while this kind of looks promising, that it looks like there's more fish biomass compared to other areas along the coastline, Alex did some surveys over in Sudan, which is in the red oval. So this was directly opposite and comparable. And from this, we were able to try and see how close to a pristine environment the Saudi Arabian reefs would be compared to Sudan. And the benefit of using Sudan is they don't have a large impact on the reefs there through fishing. They don't have the culture or the means to heavily fish the reefs. And so we're able to compare the two. And you can see very quickly and easily from that bar chart there where the red bars biomass estimates of a certain number of key targeted fishery species, that there's really huge differences in biomass between Sudan and Saudi Arabian reefs. And so even though this region does have much higher biomass than the others, it's significantly less compared to what we would expect it if it wasn't being heavily fished. And so this is just one approach that we've been able to use in the region. It's very difficult to get fisheries data. The fisheries is not regulated and not reported, so we have no way of actually monitoring or getting catch rates or identifying what's actually been caught. So this is one method that's showing us that the reefs in Saudi Arabia are actually potentially not doing as well as we thought. We're also starting to look at how we can use this data to look at productivity as well. So the amount of biomass that's being produced in different regions of reef fish. And we get a sort of a pattern where R1 and R2, which is right up in the north, is lower than the other regions. And this is likely driven by temperature and also nutrients as well. So as we go south, the water's temperature is getting warmer and we're having more input of nutrients through the strait at the south of the Red Sea. And we can also partition this into different species and different trophic groups as well. When we looked at that, we found this was driven a lot by planktivorous fish producing a lot of this increase in biomass. And for those not familiar with fish too much, this graph here basically takes the different traits that fish produce and contribute to an ecosystem. So every organism within an ecosystem is playing a role. So whether they are helping to remove algae, whether they're getting eaten by other large fish and helping to move energy through the food chain. So we're also looking at instead of a species level composition of reef fish, what role do they play, what traits do they have, and how do those traits work towards creating a healthy ecosystem. And so I won't go through this figure, but what I want you to take away from this is that we can assign traits to all these different reef fish. We can then put them together to see what combination of traits each species of fish, and then look at whether these change in different regions or different reefs or different transects across space. And we can see if some of these traits are missing. And so, for example, in the region 4, we found that there's a lot of functional entities, which are a group of traits sort of put together, are quite low. And so this is represented by one species. So this also means that there's a lot of vulnerability in the system. And so if you have one species contributing a unique set of traits to the ecosystem, then if these are overfished and removed and the number of them or the biomass of these reduced as well, then it can have significant effects on how the ecosystem performs and actually maintains its role or helps rebound from some disturbance. So all these fish communities that we've been looking at up until now are the larger fish that you can normally see when you're either diving or snorkeling on a reef. But we're starting to know that there's a lot of fish that we don't see on the reef. So when you swim around, there's lots of these very small fish called CRYPTOBENTHIC fish. These are fish that don't grow larger than like 5 centimeters. They're very hard to see. They live within the reef matrix. But we're starting to get a gauge on their importance on the ecosystem as well. Unfortunately, you can't swim around the reef and survey these because most of the time you don't see them. So we've been doing some collections with ichthyosides to try and capture these and actually look at the biodiversity of these fish, and also to look at how they change through spatial distributions and also their functional role as well. So we did a range of these stations along the coast. They're standardized so we can compare them. They're all done with the same method. And this photo on the bottom right shows a collection of fish from one station. And these stations are 2 meters by 2 meters, and we're basically collecting every little fish that's living within there. So we have to do a lot of rummaging, a lot of looking under rocks. And we're finding that they're very diverse. So across these stations, we found over 200 different species of these little fish, which is actually quite a lot. But the difficult thing is that they're very hard to ID because not many people know much about them. It's hard enough to ID the larger fish in the region, but these little ones don't exist in taxonomic books. And so we did use DNA barcoding to try and assign these to a species level. And again, we had very unsuccessful with that as well. So over 50% of them we couldn't assign to a species. So there's a fish that visually and morphologically we can't identify them, and also when we barcode them, they're not matching to anything online. So we can see that they change through time, change through space. So in the south, we're finding on average around 160 fish within a 200 square meter plot, which is quite showing that they're extremely abundant. And we're finding upwards of 34 different species within a plot as well. So even within a very small plot on the reef, there's very high diversity and very high abundance. And these fish are extremely important. They have very short lifespans, so they have very high turnover. They're also very important for contributing energy through the system. So a lot of them, if we think, are feeding on small benthic invertebrates, and then they're getting consumed by slightly larger fish as well. So they're very important energetic connection from the benthic environment to larger fish. We're finding very distinct patterns in these as well. So this blue area, this is a multi-dimensional space. The blue area down the bottom is the Farrison Islands, and we're finding very distinct fish communities compared to in the central regions, and also cross-shelf patterns as well. So as you move around, these fish are changing very much considerably. And so we're looking to expand some collections up into the north as well to see how they change up there. We have done some surveys and published these from the large lagoon system in the north. And so one of the things we really want to tease out with these little fish is what they actually do in the ecosystem and what particular type of role. And then we can start to assign those same traits and those same functional analysis to these groups as well to try and build a complete picture. Because at the moment, we're just surveying mainly the larger fish, which is only half of the puzzle. We're starting to try to identify what types of habitat they depend on as well, so that we can see how reef degradation and changes in the environment impact them. For these, we use a ichthyoside, but in other parts of the world or in other systems, you're not allowed to use specific chemicals. So we're we're also designed and use some of these small sort of fish houses that we can put down on the reef to try and attract these small cryptic fish into them. These are standardized as well, and then we can replicate these through different areas. And so we actually have this in a publication which was just accepted today. And other tools that we're trying to use to identify fish communities is with eDNA, and a lot of you are probably familiar with this, particularly in the areas where the water's murky, it's hard to work in, it's cold, there might be hazards in the water. This isn't really a popular tool in coral reefs because you can quite comfortably get in the water, you can snorkel or dive around and see what you need to see. But there's also some pros and cons in this, and so we published a publication a few years ago to try and look at how well this works on coral reefs, and also to try and see if it's picking up any of these cryptobenthic fish as well, which we visually can't see. And so we had some success. So you can see the first bar with the little red fish that grows to about 2 centimeters long. It picked up some of the species within that genus. But overall, it wasn't overly successful. And so we're working to try and modify this approach so that we can have a little bit better method of trying to detect some of these small fish using the eDNA methods with water and sediment. And again, we ran into a similar problem with this method as we do with a lot of the other work we do, that there's just very little on the organisms in the Red Sea. So if we're comparing these to sequences that are online, if there's nothing online, then we can't match it. And that's really what we're running into, a big problem. So we're trying to do a lot of these collections as well and get sequences up online to facilitate some of these other projects down the line. And I had to have some butterfly fish slides in here. And so using a similar approach, we're trying to increase our understanding of what some of the fish are actually doing in the Red Sea, what are they depending on. And so butterfly fish are historically been used for feeding observations. So you can follow them around, you can see what they eat. They have very small mouths and are very deliberate in what they are eating. And majority of them are either corallivores, some of them specializing on specific species of coral, and some of them eating a range of other benthic organisms. So as I said earlier, over half of the butterfly fish in the Red Sea are endemic to the region. And so we wanted to document what they're depending on, what they're feeding on in the Red Sea, but using an approach that we could sort of increase our resolution. And so this figure here shows the output with both CO1 and 18S. And the top two graphs show the relative reed abundance of some of the sort of broad categories of what these fish are eating. And on the bottom is the frequency of occurrence. And so we can start to look at what percentage of their diet is made up of different types of benthic taxa, but also start to see what they're using and how diverse their diet is. And this plot here gives a really good idea of the fact that they're eating a lot more than what we think. That a lot of them have specialized diets, but also a lot of overlapping in the diets. But the majority of them are still getting their diet, their energy from hard corals. So a lot of them are hard coral feeders, but they're also supplementing these with a range of other organisms like small copepods, marine worms, soft corals, and other things growing on the hard benthic environment. One of the really interesting outputs that I got from this is that we were detecting benthic organisms within their stomach that have not yet been documented in the Red Sea. So given these fish are swimming around and eating the benthic environment, they're potentially a way of sampling the benthic environment for us, particularly small and cryptic benthic organisms that are hard for standardized surveys. So these butterfly fish obviously rely on live coral cover for majority of their diet. And when I first moved to Saudi in 2014, there was a lot of talk about how this region was pristine and how it was potentially a sort of study area for future scenarios driven around climate change, because the environment there was already so extreme. We were already detecting 34 degrees water temperatures with the corals that were still thriving and in very good condition, whereas in other parts of the world, when they start getting even to 29 or 30, they'll start bleaching and dying. So it's a really sort of promising idea, but sadly, since I've been there, we have had bleaching events and a considerable one in 2015. So in the red circled areas, the Farrison Banks, which is a very extensive network of coral reefs. In 2015, a lot of this area was bleached and subsequently died. And so we did do some surveys post-bleaching, and it's very sad. Some of the reefs we documented up to 90% of the corals had actually died. So this also shows that this region is not immune to the effects of climate change, and that we really need to start thinking more broadly about this. Is this common or not? Obviously, as I showed with the status of research in the region, we don't really know too much about the Red Sea. So it's hard to go back and find documentations of historical bleaching events. There's a nice paper published by one of the postdocs in our lab, Tom, in 2020, where he took coral cores of some of these corals. So it's kind of very similar to sediment cores, except you're drilling into very large coral skeletons that are on the reef, and you can take out these coral cores and you can look back and see growth bands relating to different seasons, and you can look for stress or areas of dead. This is a figure here where there's a small arrow, which is a white band showing when there was a bleaching event. And so after the bleaching event, we had a trip down to the Farrison Banks region, and we collected a lot of fish and also drilled a lot of corals to try and look at if we could put together some of the history of the bleaching event. And you can just see by this figure that based on what we found, these bleaching events are a more recent occurrence, and also the more recent ones are more widespread and have a significant impact on the corals there. And I mentioned fishing as well. So this is sadly one of the biggest impacts to a lot of the fish. So the coral bleaching impacts a lot of the fish indirectly by removing a lot of the food that the corallivores, the fish that feed on the coral, need, but it also removes a lot of the structure and a lot of the habitat for a lot of the fish. And the fishing directly removes the fish. So at present, most of the fishing in the Red Sea is unregulated, and it's commonly done by small boats with one or two fishermen that are using hook and line, small traps on some of the complex reef environments, and then on the reef flats they're putting out gill nets. And so these are indiscriminately catching everything, and sadly they're keeping everything as well. So when you do visit these fish markets, you can see a lot of fish that are obviously targeted by fishermen, but you can also see a lot of fish that aren't targeted by fishermen, and generally at a lower value, but they're still being sold as well. And this includes all different trophic groups. So some of the traps will catch corallivorous fish, or fish that you can't catch with hook and line, and also sharks as well, and rays. So looking forward, one of the biggest changes in the regions is based around the Vision 2030 of the region, which is looking to diversify income away from oil. This is just for Saudi Arabia here. And so there's some large GIGA projects that are happening. In particular, some of them are right on the coast. So if you have some time, later on, I'd ask you can go to YouTube and look up NEOM or the Red Sea Development Company, and you can see some stunning videos of what they propose to do in these regions. They're very large in scale. These ones are all situated right on the coast, adjacent to coral reefs, and so this is potentially a large sort of change to the system, and they have said that they want to try and work with the environment and to try and sustain the environment and also increase what they have there. So the Red Sea Development Company is a large coastal lagoon there. It's around 60 kilometers in length, and they're building some luxury tourist villas and sort of Maldives style tourist accommodation and hotels. And they've working towards trying to have a minimal impact on the region, and they're also looking at increasing their biomass of reef fish or their coverage of coral cover by 30%. So it's quite ambitious. All these different entities are working closely with researchers at KAUST to try and make these achievable. So they're starting to use technology to look at different ways of outgrowing coral reefs. They're setting up coral nurseries as well. And also for fish, they're looking at removing all the fishing or putting some management aspects into the fishing in the region so that they can try and bring some of the biodiversity and particularly the biomass of some of these fishes. And a lot of this is in their best interest because most of these are driven around tourism, and the tourism people coming for the environment. So if they can increase and enhance these, then it should be more beneficial from then. So there's a lot sort of moving forward in this region, a lot to keep us busy. And at the moment, it's very exciting to be there. We're still, like I said, scratching the surface of what we know in the region, starting to piece together a picture of the ecosystem and how it changes. With that, I'll take any questions that you have.
So, has anyone got any questions?
Thank you, Darren. That's a really interesting question. You talked about the vulnerability with respect to traits and that being lower in that central region. Is that potentially because some specific target species are being overfished, or is that more related to species?
Yeah, that's a good point. So all of the different species contribute a different set of traits to the environment. So it could be that the environment is not a suitable habitat for that particular species, doesn't support that species in order to be there to provide those traits, or it could be that they're being removed somehow. So in that central region is close to Jeddah, which is a very large city right on the coast. And there's a huge port there. There's also a lot of industry as well. So is potentially that there's some impact from those coastal there's the coastal work that's been done there and the input, but it's hard to tease out as well. Yeah. We're still trying to get a handle on some of these traits. Trying to assign them to some species is challenging, and also trying to understand the specific importance or role that some of these traits play in the ecosystem. But generally, all of these species of fish are there, and they've found some kind of niche that they're fitting into the system, and in some way they're playing a role that is either a few species have or none. And so it's trying to identify which traits are really important for maintaining the health of the ecosystem, finding out which species are providing those traits, and then trying to manage or protect those. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Chris?
many of you have put the benthic fishes, juvenile stages of other ones that just transition to those.
Yeah, that's a good question. So some of the the juvenile species of reef fish have a very different needs compared to the adults. They often look very different. They play a different role. They depend on different food sources. Most of these cryptic fish that we're collecting are actually fully grown at about 2 or 3 or 4 centimeters. So a lot of the juveniles of some of these other species, you can spot them. You can still assign them to a different group. But these little fish are not growing much bigger than an inch, but they're extremely abundant and very diverse. So we do know they have very high turnover. They're only living for a couple of months, some of them. They're also recruiting often multiple times throughout the year rather than 1 or 2 pulses a year. So there's a really high turnover in them. And so they're clearly really important for the energetics of the ecosystem. But we're also trying to identify what they're eating, what's eating them, and what other particular roles do they have. So.
Any other questions from you?
Yep.
One last one, a little bit of your presentation. The secretarial issue species in the larger.
Yeah, I asked that when I was moved there. I would say I don't know. And there's no reports of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. And you will see them catching and eating certain species of fish there in large volumes that in other parts of the world people stay away from. So it's hard to know. No one's that I know of has specifically looked for it, tested for it, and so yeah, I would say the answer is I don't know. We don't know. Yeah.
Charlie, did you have a question? I can see you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. It was a great talk. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. Well, 1 question really, which is that the warming experiment, it looks really interesting. It's probably the most, I would say, the most relevant system to do that in the world. And I'm just curious, what's causing that? What's the primary reason driving the winter and summer temperature difference? Is it because of the incoming solar radiation, or is it oceanographic?
Hi, Charles. So you mean the difference in water temperature?
Yeah, because if it's solar input, then we wouldn't expect to see a huge change with climate change. But if it's influenced primarily by ocean currents, then we would potentially.
Yeah, So couple of things there. So there's a natural latitudinal gradient in the temperature. So in the north, the water temperatures are getting much cooler than the south, and the south in the winter, and then also in the south in the summer, it's getting much warmer. As I mentioned about vertical, as you go deeper, it doesn't get much colder. So it's quite well mixed, and that's mainly because there's not a lot of cold water coming in. So there's and then in the summertime, so you do have water currents coming in through the south. So there's a very, very narrow and very shallow entrance at the south that you get some water flowing into the Red Sea. And depending on the currents, that often gets pushed up along the right-hand side, along the Saudi coast. But it depends on the different years. There's a lot of eddies and a lot of wind-driven currents as well that move things around. As for the water getting so warm in the sun, in the summer, I would say it's based on warm air, and mainly because the air temperature is really warm as well. So it's very hard to work in the field in the summers. You know, everyone probably here likes to go in the summer, but it's very hard there. You have air temperatures of excess of 40 degrees, and then you have water temperature over 30 degrees. And so if you're out all day in and out of the water, you're getting hot and you're sweating and dehydrating even while you're in the water. And then you get out onto the boat and it's magnified again. So it's a very challenging environment there.
Great, thank you.
I had a question if no one else has got any more. Thank you for including the butterfly fish. That was what I did my PhD on, butterfly fish feeding. So specifically around the butterfly fish, but more generally, do you find that the ecological patterns you're seeing in the Red Sea, so like the feeding patterns of the butterfly fish or any other sort of large scale ecological processes, are really similar to the other major reef systems? So they're obviously different species and maybe slightly different dynamics, but overall, are you seeing the same ecological patterns we see in the GBR and in the Caribbean and the Red Sea, or is it quite different, like very, very different ecologically as well?
Yeah, it's very similar when you have, even when you have endemic species there, they're obviously not found anywhere else, but they kind of you know, sister species or very closely related to another species that you'd find in say the Great Barrier Reef or the Pacific, and you'll find often they play a very similar role in the ecosystem and feed on very similar types of organisms, be it macroalgae or benthic organisms. And so obviously they're playing a very similar role, but what they're actually eating is probably quite different. So if we go back to the butterfly fish, a lot of them that are corallivores are still getting, I think, like 90% of their diet from coral. The problem is that it's likely that a lot of the corals in the Red Sea are endemic. And so I think at present, out of those 360 species of coral in the Red Sea, I think only like 4% of them are listed as endemic. And since researchers at KAUST, particularly Francesco Benzoni, have been starting to look at coral species in the Red Sea, they're finding that they're not what we think we've documented them at. So many of the acroporas are turning out to be endemic. A lot of species that we thought were the same species but looked slightly different are turning out to be completely different species. We're even recently finding new families of corals in the Red Sea, new genuses. So it's it's likely that they're still eating what looks like the same kind of corals, but they're actually a different species. So it's just the more you start looking, the more kind of questions you have. And with the butterfly fish, only half of them we can really compare to other parts of the world to see if they're eating the same thing. But obviously they're dictated by what's available to them as well, which makes it difficult. Yeah.
Sorry, just with that high level of endemism that you were talking about with corals, do you think that has any sort of impact on how and be kind of like this future scenario for other regions of the world that the corals are so big there?
Yeah.
Is it relatable?
Yeah, good question. I guess, first thing to mind is, you could take corals from the Red Sea and start planting them around the world. Obviously, that leads to a lot of problems. But yeah, people are starting to look at why the Red Sea corals are so resilient. But it is very complex, as you know, with corals. They have, bacteria and zooxanthellae and all sorts of things that work together to either keep them happy or not. One of the professors at KAUST is working with probiotics at the moment, and so there's a large scale field experiment going on where her and her group are administering probiotics to corals to look at whether that helps or not during stressful times. So similar to humans, whether we can take probiotic tablets or drinks to try and increase it in our system to help us a little bit healthier, or shake off a cold or something. Same sort of idea as going towards corals, where you identify the natural probiotics that are beneficial to the corals and then you can give them back to them in certain times of the year in large dosages. So they've been for last year administering probiotics to a range of corals on one of the reefs off KAUST to try and see if they fare better through time, particularly over the summer periods as well. So one of the things I've been doing with the fish is trying to look at how that has a flow-on impact to the fish as well, either directly, because when you give the coral probiotics, a lot of the fish are living within the coral are directly impacted by it, but then also, you know, the overall health of that ecosystem as well. So that's another angle to try and counteract that as well. Yeah.
We have to take last question and then we'll need to close up.
You mentioned that it's really hard because let's say half of the fish that you find regards to the CRYPTOBENTHIC fish aren't even identified, and you're working with different so what do you expect in the next couple of years? Will you come up with an entire new book of new species from the Red Sea? Do you think there will be a fish called
Yeah, so we have a lot of these fish collected. I'm not a taxonomist, so it's very difficult for me to go through them and identify them. So a lot of them we did send to California Academy of Science in the hopes that these would be accessible to the wider taxonomists and that they could, people in different fields could access them and go through them. So we have had some colleagues around the world access these specimens in different groups. So particularly the small gobies, where they're working through to try and identify them and see how they fit in. And I have a PhD student just started, Victor. He's actually really interested in identifying a lot of these species as well, and then also looking at how they vary spatially as well, because some of these fish appear to look, it's trying to describe it. You find two fish and they look different when you're collecting them, and you start finding more and you realize you don't know, oh, it looks a little bit like that one, a little bit like that one. And so trying to really get a handle on if the different life stages, the different sex, the environments affecting them, the different morphology. So it's really tricky. Genetics is we thought going to help, but it's actually making it harder. But at least where the genetics from all these fish are now online, we also have really good images of them all as well. And then we're also preserving all the specimens. So while we haven't figured them out yet, they're sitting there for someone to take the time to go through them. And some people are keen to do that. So, you know, so just give you an example, some of the small coral dwelling gobies, we got up to like species 32 because we just kept finding more that we just didn't look like anything that we thought they were, and they weren't matching to anything. So again, these could be all endemics to the Red Sea. And then that sort of brings up the question of what corals do they depend on there as well, because in other parts of the world, these small coral dwelling gobies are very specific coral species that they inhabit. So
thanks so much, Darren. We really appreciate you taking the time and coming across, especially given your journey from Taupo the other day, and also just being in New Zealand. It's really great to have a talk on something quite different to what we normally get. So as a token of our appreciation, I'll put that one there for you.
thank you.
And yeah, thank you everyone for coming along, and thanks to those on Zoom as well.